Matt Hancock cried, didn't he, when talking about the new vaccine? What does it mean when politicians cry? Let's have a look at politicians crying. Let's look at the way the pandemic has served the interests of the powerful and affected ordinary people. And let's look at evocative images of crying politicians while looking at the reality that it's potentially masking.
I mean, just simple words there, reacting it. You're quite emotional by that.
Well, it's just, it's been such a tough year.
But I don't think that's actual crying, is it? It's sort of laughing.
Well,
What I would say is it was definitely theatrical. Whether or not he's crying, I mean, he's evidently not crying if what you mean by crying is tears coming out of someone's eyes, because that's not what's happened. But it was interesting and performative, and I do think that what would be understood as a moment of revelation did take place. Like that Matt Hancock had a reaction, an unconscious reaction, demonstration of relief, which I think was closer to laughter than crying, but was nonetheless revelatory, and for him required an element of theatre to continue it. Crying in public has very particular connotations. Done correctly, or perhaps we could argue done authentically, it carries a great deal of meaning, but it's a true feeling, beyond language, beyond performance. But if we query it at all, if it doesn't seem authentic, then what does it become? The ultimate artifice, the ultimate cynicism of deploying that which we consider to be authentic in order to meet your own ends. What we by and large expect and experience from politicians is a complete lack of sincerity and authenticity. It's not often that a political figure emerges that we feel intuitively we can trust, that they're telling us the truth, that they're being honest. And the reason for that is because they're not. £18 billion in coronavirus related contracts were awarded during the first 6 months of the pandemic, with £1.5 billion going to companies with connections to the Conservative Party. Companies with a government referral were 10 times more likely to end up winning a contract than those without. And check out this, that this is a story you might be familiar with. An acquaintance and former neighbour of Matt Hancock is supplying the government with tens of millions of vials for NHS COVID-19 tests, despite having no previous experience of producing medical supplies. Meanwhile, in the United States, a batch of contracts worth $194 million went to Health Supply US, a company founded 6 months ago by a former Trump administration official. Zach Fuentes, LLC, which is led by President Trump's former Deputy Chief of Staff, was awarded a $3 million federal contract to provide respirator masks, which subsequently couldn't be used. So, like, there's this performative element of politics going on the TV and sort of cry laughing. Then there's this reality of politics, contracts awarded, decisions made that are advantageous to friends, affiliates and associates. I suppose what this indicates is behind the theatre of conventional politics, business as usual is being conducted. In fact, it's business better than usual for the extremely wealthy. The coronavirus pandemic and corresponding lockdown has made way for one of the greatest wealth transfers in history. Billionaires increased their wealth by more than a quarter at the height of the crisis, from March to June, just as 42 million Americans filed for jobless claims or struggled to get by on government schemes. It's not just corporate power that's increasing. The pandemic has been used to mobilise an increase of state power, which of course to some degree must be necessary to control a pandemic. But let's have a look at some of the examples and see if they seem appropriate to you. The Australian government has enacted a series of measures, including the use of smartphone contact tracing technology. In Britain, ministers have increased powers to detain people and close borders. Israel's Prime Minister has shut down courts and begun surveillance of citizens. Chile has sent the military to public squares once occupied by protesters. Bolivia has postponed elections. Critics say some governments are using the public health crisis as cover to seize new powers that have little to do with the outbreak. And certainly there would be form for that in that great and defining disaster of the modern era, the 9/11 attacks. We of course saw an increase in legislative power in the shape of the Patriot Act, essentially gave birth to the surveillance age, or gave rise to it in a hitherto unseen form. So in spite of this level of performance, the reality has been a great transfer of wealth has taken place. Meanwhile, state-imposed sanctions are being proposed on the most vulnerable people, and insufficient measures are being taken to ensure the safety and protection of the most vulnerable members of society?
It's just, there's so much work gone into this, and I'm really, it makes you proud to be British.
Let's have a look at some more politicians crying and see what it makes us feel.
Whatever challenges come before us, I will always believe our nation's best days lie ahead. God bless.
Sometimes I think they're not crying on behalf, like it's not tears of compassion, but it's actually the opposite, rather individualistic, egocentric expression of tears.
I see that, we notice now that it's affecting you now, and it must have been
Yes,
the
it's not
most
affecting
difficult.
my voice now.
It's not affecting my voice. I can still basically be Margaret Thatcher.
With enormous and enduring gratitude to have had the opportunity to serve the country I love.
That was very sincere, that one. Too sincere. That one gives me a little bit of a shut up. The country I love. I was actually trying to organise you a birthday party. Well, you've ruined that, haven't you? Why not give the final word on this matter to the psychoanalyst Carl Jung? Carl Jung looked to the alchemical process, the ancient quest to transmute base metals into gold, as a symbolic model for psychic change. One part of the alchemical process, called solutio, involved dissolving the matter in its own water. Described in the words of Jungian analyst Edward Edinger, the psychological process of solutio takes place when something larger and more comprehensive than the personal ego overwhelms and dissolves it. From a Jungian point of view, a potential link always exists between the personal unconscious and the archetypal. So in that sense, all adult crying could transcend the personal. What I think is important about that is that crying is a really, really weird thing when anybody does it. Like when you feel really sad, tears come out of your face, suddenly your persona is interrupted. Isn't the self a kind of performance? This is who I am, this is how I feel, I've done my hair, I've put a scarf on. If I was to suddenly break down crying, you'd see a different side of me. You are biologically programmed, evolved as I am, to feel an intuitive response to another person crying. Our mirror neurons click on and suddenly we see another person as connected to us. That is why it's deeply either cynical or selfish when a politician cries in public, unless it is a legitimate, serious and authentic expression of the deep, profound pain that underscores the temporary identity of the individual. That is not what was happening to Matt Hancock. He was actually, I think, laughing or feeling kind of embarrassed and was engaged in a sort of performance, a performance that's been used to mask, it seems to me at least, a transfer of wealth and power, and has facilitated a kind of bleak opportunism that we've long associated with politicians of his kind and that particular currently empowered political party. Elsewhere, the examples of crying, whether it's Thatcher or Clinton or Obama or Bush or, well, not Trump. Trump don't cry.
I'm not a big crier. I like to get things done. I'm not a big crier.
It's either out of personal feeling or it's out of performance. Now, what does that tell us about the way that we are governed? That we accept that governance is a type of performance, that it's taking place behind a veil, that we don't expect to interact authentically with people that are supposed to lead us. Perhaps what we really need to consider is the systems themselves. Are these systems even capable of being authentic? Are they even capable of doing anything other than utilising a pandemic to create opportunities, financial and business opportunities for their affiliates? It seems not. Politics and politicians behave in a particular manner to achieve very specific ends. It's not a time where we can say, wow, there was a global pandemic and the people in positions of power really came together to do the right thing. Far from it. It was yet another revelation, yet another demonstration that what's required is radical change, that you and I need to become empowered in our own lives and think about how we want communities to be run, how we want resources to be shared, and not outsource that power to people that have entirely different intentions, motivations, and affiliations than we do.